If we want to build a foundation to cast a long arc of athleticism across the lifespan, to go faster and further, what does that look like? To tip the scales of physiology, to perform not just in this decade, but in those that follow, what do we need to know today? This series is about athletic health span, the science of building endurance, strength, and resilience. Looking inside the training programs of some of the most elite athletes, we find a tool for building extraordinary levels of fitness and at the same time, protection against injury. It's a tool that's available to everyone, and whether you're training for a 5K, your first triathlon, or an ultramarathon, this tool can be indispensable for building a fitness foundation and breaking through plateaus. That tool is Polarized training. Before we get into the science, I want to take a moment to tell you about where I was around 10 years ago, because I think a lot of individuals have been there before, whether you're training for speed or endurance or a combination of both of those. So at that time, I was training hard. Every day I would go and run as far as I could, as fast as I could. No days off, train until failure, and just get up and do it again the next day. I trained like it was my job, but I collected injuries like it was my job as well. I would stare at graphs like this one showing what appear to be the very real cardiovascular risks associated with doing hours and hours of excess vigorous exercise day after day. And I felt it. I felt burned out, exhausted, and dreading my workouts. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I had a thought. And that thought was a memory of my mentor as a kid growing up, crossing the finish line of his first Ironman Triathlon, a 140-mile race. And at that time, that kind of distance seemed inconceivable to me. I just knew that if I ever wanted to get there, that something would have to change. So what I want to share with you today is a tool that allowed me to get from that place to not only achieving that goal, but also building a robust cardiovascular fitness foundation. So with that, let's get into the science. If we listen to the fitness media, we hear a lot about work ethic, higher intensities more often, basically trying to do the fun part all the time. But the scientific data tell a different story about how we can build a robust fitness foundation to carry us where we want to go without running ourselves into the ground. When we look at the training regimens of many, if not most, elite endurance athletes, we find that they're exactly opposite of what we might expect. These athletes tend to spend the vast majority of their training time at low intensities, placing strategically higher intensity exercise within their training routines. A 2021 study, for example, found that across 6,771 marathon runners, those with the fastest race times spent the vast majority of their time in low intensity exercise compared with slower runners who spent more time in the moderate and high intensity zones. Why is that? It's because these athletes know that high intensity and moderate intensity exercise are expensive. They put us into what I like to think about as recovery debt. So what is recovery debt? Recovery debt describes the fatiguing effects of exercise that necessitate a recovery period before we're ready to go out and perform such exercise again. And we incur recovery debt whenever we go out and perform high intensity exercise or long duration exercise. Recovery debt can be seen across a variety of organ systems, for example, the heart, the nervous system, and the musculoskeletal system. So let's take the heart. In the heart, for example, we can see recovery debt showing up as exercise-induced cardiac fatigue. This can show up in a few different metrics. One is desynchronization between the electrical and the mechanical activity of the heart, called electromechanical delay. We also see recovery debt show up as temporary changes in the lengthening and shortening of the chambers of the heart, called diastolic dysfunction. We also see increases in cardiac enzymes like proBNP and troponin, although the clinical significance of these is not yet fully known. We can also see recovery debt show up in the nervous system, both centrally and peripherally. And in the central nervous system, we've become aware recently of a phenomenon that scientists call supraspinal fatigue. One of the most prominent features of supraspinal fatigue is that the motor cortex, the area of our brain that generates voluntary motor commands, is no longer able to generate those commands with the same intensity that it once was before exercise. Now, we don't yet know the mechanisms exactly of supraspinal fatigue, mostly because the studies that have looked at this have utilized electrical signals measured outside the skull rather than being able to look in at the individual neuron level. But we do know that probably a key player in this is the increase in the ratio of serotonin to dopamine that occurs after intense exercise. In the muscular system, recovery debt shows up in a few different ways. It's well known that ATP is depleted during exercise and metabolites accumulate, leading to decreased contractile force, but that's operating on the order of seconds to minutes. On the order of minutes or hours to days, muscles also go through muscle microtrauma. That in itself can cause decreased contractile force. It can also lead to inflammation within the muscles to recruit inflammatory cells and sensitize pain receptors so that the body is trying to protect itself against additional trauma to the muscles. Now, not all inflammation is bad or negative. It's important, in fact, for inflammatory cells to be recruited to the local area for muscle fiber remodeling. And finally, if intense training goes on for too long, we can also see disruptions to the endocrine system or hormone levels. Bottom line is that these changes take time to recover from, and that can interfere with our ability to keep training volumes high and therefore disrupt our ability to acquire fitness adaptations. So our goal in polarized training is to maximize cardiovascular fitness adaptations by keeping volumes high and minimizing recovery debt. Polarized training aims at two specific objectives. The first is endurance, or the ability to do cardiovascular exercise for as long as we can or for as far as we can. We want to be able to swim or run or bike or hike or row for as long as possible on the order of hours and still feel like we have some left in the tank to go further. To accomplish that, we allocate about 80 to 90% of our training time to low-intensity exercise. Scientists have a term for this, and that is high-volume, low-intensity training. And high-volume, low-intensity training aims for several key fitness adaptations. The first of these key adaptations is improvement in cardiac output capacity, mainly by increasing stroke volume, or the amount of blood that our heart can pump per contraction. The second adaptation aims at mitochondrial biogenesis, or increasing the number of mitochondria per cell. The third adaptation is an increase in our ability to use stored fat for fuel. And the fourth is to increase our vascular capacity so that we can carry more oxygen to our muscle fibers. Now, the second goal of polarized training is to increase speed or power. To accomplish that, we allocate about 10 to 20% or 10 to 15% of our training time to high-intensity exercise. Now, keep in mind the reason why we're allocating a small amount of our training time to high-intensity exercise is to minimize recovery debt. High-intensity exercise aims at a few adaptations. The first is that it allows us to train in biomechanical states that we might not be ready to be in low-intensity exercise. Think about the transition from jogging to running in the different positions that our extremities are in. Those are very different patterns of muscle fiber recruitment and firing patterns. It also aims at improvements in heart rate recovery and improvement in the lactate threshold. We'll get into that in just a moment. And increases in enzymes that shuttle the carbon from glucose or carbohydrates through our cells and into other energy systems in the cell. So we've talked about different intensities and their purpose. Now, how do we identify them when we're training, and how do we build training programs around them? Before we talk about this, it's important to know that none of this is medical advice, and you should always consult with your doctor. Ask to make sure that you're healthy enough for exercise and that you are healthy enough for different kinds of exercise. Now, the easiest way to know that you're in low-intensity exercise is that it should be easy to carry on a conversation without getting out of breath. Another fairly easy way to identify the upper limit of low-intensity exercise is using a heart rate monitor. The idea is that during low-intensity exercise, we want to be training under what is called our maximum aerobic heart rate. Now, there are a few different ways to identify the maximum aerobic heart rate. I like to use what's called the MAF 180 method, and I'll link to that in the description. But we take 180, we subtract our age, and then depending upon health and fitness status and age, we may subtract or add a couple of points. Let's take someone who's 35 years old. We would take 180, subtract their age, which is 35, from 180, and that would put us at 145 beats per minute. That person would want to wear a heart rate monitor and then exercise at a level that keeps their heart rate below 145 beats per minute. Now, a couple of things to note if you're new to heart rate training. The first is that if you're using a fitness watch and you've never used it before with a chest strap, you should wear a chest strap and make sure that the fitness watch is accurate. Many of them don't record heart rate quite accurately. The second is that if someone is otherwise healthy and they're having a hard time during low intensity exercise, keeping their heart rate under that target, it's nothing to necessarily be discouraged about. When I first started using a heart rate training method, I would go only about 20 minutes and it would be very difficult for me to keep my heart rate under target. I really had to trust the process during this period of time. After about a month, it became much easier to keep my heart rate below that target. So our bodies do make fitness adaptations. Sometimes it just takes time. Now, if we're talking about precision or personalized fitness, we can go to a lab. And what we're looking for in a lab is to identify the lactate threshold, specifically what we call the first lactate threshold, where a lactate takes off, as well as the first ventilatory threshold, where it becomes more difficult to hold a conversation. It's related to respiratory rate, but not quite the same. And those can help to identify a target heart rate using more objective data in a laboratory. Keep in mind that as someone gains fitness, those metrics might change, and so you may need to have them remeasured. Now, what about higher intensity exercises? These typically correspond with zones 4 or 5 on a smartwatch. On a cycle trainer, you could also use watts. But since high intensity training requires a lot of focus, I personally do not use heart rate because I feel that it's distracting. So what I will do instead is use perceived exertion, and then I will go back later on and correlate the perceived exertion with heart rate to see if I was on target. There's no right or wrong way to do high intensity training. We can do interval training or repetitive cycles of submaximal or maximal exertion, or we can do continuous blocks like 20 minutes or so of high intensity training. Personally, on my high intensity days, I'll do a 5-minute warm up and then I'll run 2 miles with 3 or 4 all out sprints, resting or coming to a jog in between. Now, we've gone over how to identify intensity zones, but how does this play out across the training week and how can we build training programs around that? A reasonable approach is to take the total training volume, or in this case, the total training time, and redistribute that across a week with varying different intensities assigned to different days. For example, if someone is currently doing 5 days a week of cardiovascular exercise at a moderate intensity, and they're doing that for about an hour a day, we can take that time and spread it across the week so that we have 1 day of high intensity and the remaining are lower intensity, longer duration. If this is working well, then in addition to a single short high intensity training day, we can also add in another high intensity or moderate intensity short duration training day into the week for a more pyramidal shaped training distribution. And from a technical perspective, this is actually more common among elite endurance athletes. Now, the most important thing of all of this is to listen to your body. If someone is feeling run down with a training program like this, it's really important to back off that training volume, even rest altogether. Get checked out by your doctor, make sure that there's nothing else like an illness or dehydration, overtraining syndrome, lack of electrolytes, lack of sleep that are playing into why someone is feeling run down. Thanks for listening. If you want to support this channel, the very best way to do that is to hit the subscribe button and the like button. If you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, it helps the channel out a lot. If you leave a review, you can also head over to nicksterling.com where you can find the sign up for the newsletter. So with that, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.